Welcome back to another episode of ACR On Air, the official podcast of the American College of Rheumatology. I am your host, Dr. John Hausman. Show notes for this episode can be found at acronair.org. You can find our previous episodes on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Podcast, and on your favorite podcast app. We all grew up in academia during our medical training. For many of us, medical school, residency, and fellowship were typically done in large academic medical centers. Venturing outside of academia was always scary to me. I always saw it as this unknown void that once you get there, you never really come back. However, there's one person that makes this trip outside of academia seem really exciting and interesting, and that's Dr. Herbert Baraf. Dr. Baraf is the former managing partner and founder of Arthritis and Rheumatism Associates in the Washington, D.C. area, which is actually one of the largest private rheumatology practices in the country. He recently retired from practice earlier this year and is now a special volunteer at NIAMS. He holds appointments as clinical professor of medicine at George Washington University and associate clinical professor of medicine at the University of Maryland. In this episode, we discuss the reasons why he went into private practice, the risks and benefits of private practice, how to make it work for you, and many other invaluable tips for those interested in exploring this world or those already living in it. I really hope you enjoy this conversation. Herb, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Thanks, John.
So tell me, we spend all of our training among academic hospitals, medical schools, residency, even fellowship, for the most part is in these academic medical centers. How did you end up where you are in private practice?
I think I always wanted to be in private practice. Private practice, I think, back 40 years ago when I finished training was what most people did, unless they were going to be in academics. There wasn't all this corporate stuff that's built up around medical care. And I think having trained at Duke for rheumatology, where everybody was pretty much on an academic track, or at least claimed to be, those of us who were pure clinicians or clinically inclined sort of had to hide under the radar, because who's going to recruit you to a really good academic center if they think they're just going to turn you out into the wild to become a doctor of all things. So it was you sort of had to learn the walk and talk the talk of an academician, which I think is good, because I think many of the principles of learning that you get in training serve you for a lifetime, no matter where you wind up going.
Yeah. So what attracted you to private practice that you thought you always wanted to do it? Or what is it that dissuaded you from pursuing academic practice? What are the stuff in academia that you didn't like?
Oh, we only have a half an hour to 45 minutes. Is that right? So what I didn't like in academia is sort of what I don't like in large organizations, where you're, to a certain extent, you're a cog
Yep.
in a wheel, and you don't have a lot of control over your own environment, and it's difficult to be creative in the full sense of the term, to make your own environment the way you want it to be. And so, and I didn't want to have a boss. I didn't want a hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
There was a saying when I was at Duke that if you did a great job, you're not going to hear about it, but if you screw up, you'll be the first one to know. That type of structure didn't appeal to me. I had sort of an independent streak.
Yeah.
Now, the curious thing is, I went into practice. I joined one other person. We grew it to 25, and as you get larger, you need to restrain one another or you have chaos, and you
Mm.
need some sort of organizational structure. So,
Mm.
to a certain extent, you become what you abhor,
Ah,
and
interesting.
I've seen that play out in the managed care business as well.
Hmm.
Uh, but but I think it was that independence and that desire to be out from under the that hierarchy and being low man on the totem pole, so to speak. So I think that was the attraction. And I went into medicine for patient care. I didn't go into medicine for research. I didn't want to do research as a fellow, but you had to. You had to choose a research project. So mine was folkloric. I studied the relationship of moonshine and gout.
Okay.
So it was more,
Interesting.
it was more folklore
Yep.
and cultural than it was medical. But now, interestingly, in practice, um, I did clinical trials and participated in over 400 clinical trials by the time I was done, and produced some 70 plus abstracts and 30 plus reviewed journal
Wow.
articles. So, you know, I think the key to most folks who are coming out of training is you really don't know who the hell you are and what you can do, what's
Mm.
going to interest you, and what alleyways you're going to dive into and build what kind of a career you're going to have. You're just sort of, I've lectured to fellows, uh, graduating fellows for the last 20 years at the CSRO Fellows Conference. And one of the lines that I use is you're kind of like a bud on a bush. You don't know
Mm.
what the flower is going to look like until you've had a little sunlight, a little bit of freedom. And what that bloom is going to be is it's like your DNA. It unfolds gradually, and you find, and if your career is the center of your life, as it as I thought mine would be, I just had no idea where it would go.
Interesting.
Mm.
So take me back. You joined a practice with one other person. What were those initial years like? What were the things that were really difficult to do or challenging, and things that you didn't expect?
Well, I think, well, there was also an internist in the group, and it was a rheumatologist. My goal
Mm.
was to build a rheumatology practice and to have a one-stop shop in the sense that a patient could get everything they have arthritis. Mobility is an issue. Uh, so if they needed blood work done, it could be done and it could be drawn. If they needed an accurate synovial fluid analysis, we could do it. I could look at my own fluid. Uh, we gave gold in those days. You couldn't give gold without drawing the lab and checking a urine and checking a CBC. So to be able to do that in real time and then treat the patient, as opposed to having them go someplace else, get it drawn, or wait for the results to come back, a terrible inconvenience. To look at an X-ray before you put a needle in a joint and inject it, those were all of paramount importance.
Hmm.
But
So it is about, those challenges initially, right? You
yeah,
you mentioned that you joined somebody else. There was an internist, and you wanted a one-stop shop. Um,
that was the goal.
aha.
And I saw that having a critical mass of two
Ah.
rheumatologists better than one,
Yeah.
three, maybe four better than two, maybe three, right? Because then it became economical to be able to do that. What I didn't understand, well, first of all, I think we all go into our careers, we finish our training, and we figure we're God's gift to rheumatology, right? So the first stunner was I started doing internal medicine and rheumatology. There were
Okay.
other practices more prestigious, better well known in the Washington area. Although I thought I was God's gift to rheumatology, the word hadn't gotten out. So, I'd see four or five patients, including suture removal from the emergency room, uh, and that would be my day.
Okay.
So building was it wasn't a given that you were going to be busy early on, and I saw that every patient was sort of a brick in the wall
Mm.
or the edifice of what you were trying to build as a career.
Mm.
And a good rheumatologist holds on to their patients, but they're also a bit like flypaper. The rheumatologist is. You see that patient, and they become yours. And uh, so each patient you see stays with you. Um, and that to me was uh, the first lesson, that building a practice takes work. Second lesson was that the organization in which you function, and we're all, whether you're a solo practitioner or in a large institution, you have an organization. You got somebody who's got to answer the phone. You've got somebody who has to see the patient when they walk in the door. You've got uh, you have to capture the charges. You have to send out bills. You have to handle the bills correctly. When you send a patient a statement, it has to be accurate. Things have to be recorded. And I
Mm-hmm.
walked into a disaster. I walked into a practice that um, within 5 months, the whole business office either was fired or resigned.
Oh my goodness.
And I wound up answering phones in the business office. And a patient said to me, Dr. Baraf, I saw you and I thought you were a pretty good doctor, but I've called your business office 6 or 7 times to get something simple handled and they couldn't do it. So I figured if that's the way you run your business, how good a doctor could you be? I don't think I can
Oh.
continue to see you. And that was sort of the wake up call, that organization was important, that having loyal employees was important, that the first encounter the patient has on the phone, do they get a busy? Do they
Mm.
get a recording? Do they have enforced listening to music
Mm.
not of their choice? Is that acceptable? Is that the face I want to put forward? That was important.
Mm.
Um, and from there grew this sort of a frenzy that that part had to be just as good as the medical advice you gave.
That's so interesting because, we're not taught that part of sort of the business of medicine during any of our medical training.
And that's not
Um,
even business. That's just human relations,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And you have no in a large institution, that institution is either set up right or it's not. You have no control over that. And you find yourself, because things are bound to go wrong, apologizing.
Hmm.
My attitude was, when things went wrong, I'd say, tell me what happened. And I have a responsible person who will track it down, listen to the recorded phone calls you made, research your bill, find out where the problems were, and they will talk to you and get back
Hmm.
to you.
Oh, that's
And
amazing.
they were all just an arm's length away. So that was important, but I didn't consider myself a businessman. Um, Obviously, when you grow a practice to the way we grew it, it it is a business.
Yep.
And but in fact, I was coming back from a meeting and ran into Joe Croft, who was a partner of mine. Um, he had been in another practice and joined our practice towards the last several years of his career. And Joe was a former president of the ACR. And Joe was coming back from a strategic planning meeting of the ACR. And he said,
Mm-hmm.
your name came up in this meeting. I said, it did? He said, yeah. They said, Baraf, he's a businessman, isn't he? And I said, Joe, that's ACR. That sounds to me more like an epithet than praise. And uh, and I thought about it. I said, I sit down with an accountant and go over profit and loss. I have no idea what profit is. I can't tell the difference between accrual method of accounting and I forget what the other one is. I
um,
can't even keep straight claims made versus occurrence, and
uh-huh.
I don't retain that stuff. So I thought, what is it that I did that was business oriented? And it was to keep the peace among the partners and make sure there
Right.
was money left over to split when it
Mm.
was time to do a distribution. Those were my two key functions. And in the latter, I began to realize that as managed care began to grow, that they were being able to dictate the terms of the way you practice,
Yeah.
which was
So take me back. So you were previously in this practice, and now I know that you sort of just recently left this very successful private practice. How did you? When did you decide that you wanted to do things totally on your own and build your own practice? And tell me about that.
Well, no. So I was in Arthritis and Rheumatism Associates for 44 years.
Oh, so that was the
So I just
practice you
stepped down.
joined?
Yeah. So I just stepped down 4 months ago.
Right.
Yeah, 4 months ago. Um, so now I'm back in academia. I'm a special volunteer at the National Institutes of Health, seeing patients with the fellows,
Yeah, that's
and
awesome.
uh, and whereas in practice you had control over your own environment, um, some of the stuff at NIH is difficult to get things done. It takes
Mm.
us, and this is crazy, but it takes us about a good 40 minutes just to get ready to inject a knee.
Wow.
So, having you got to go down to the pharmacy to get the triamcinolone, but you you can get the lidocaine on the floor, and you got to pull
Wow.
together the. It's very difficult. I've been talking to the hierarchy in the clinic, and it's something that we need to work on. But that was so easy in practice. I'd say to a medical assistant, let's do a shoulder in room 7, walk into room 8, go back into room 7, and with ultrasound, bing, bang, bing, 2 or 3 minutes, and
That's amazing.
you were done. So, uh, and I didn't realize what a luxury it was because it just made sense. That's the way it should be.
Hmm.
Um, to give you an example, Dave Bornstein was in academia for almost 20 years at GW, and Dave joined our group about 25 years ago.
Mm.
And when David would describe to people coming through to interview his experience at the university, he would say, I'm in practice now and I can do an injection in a minute and a half, whereas it took forever. And I couldn't relate to that until now. Now I relate to that. So so the advantage of private practice is that you can move swiftly. You can
Hmm.
change, you can affect process, you can
Mm.
improve process. You
That's
can make
amazing.
from the beginning to the end of the patient's experience, or not, smooth and friction free, and give the patient a sense of confidence, um, and um, and deal with the whole spectrum of what that patient needs. A patient with RA who's on biologics and methotrexate, they need lab. They come in with a painful shoulder. You X-ray the shoulder. You inject the shoulder.
Hmm.
You send off the lab. It's all done in the space of what is scheduled as a 15-minute visit, but it may take, you know, by the end of the morning, they're out and maybe
Yeah.
they've been in the office for an hour and
Yeah.
15 minutes, getting stuff that would take them 5 or 6 hours,
Yeah. It's
to go
true.
to a lab, to go to X-ray, come back and be injected. Yeah.
Yeah. So the day to day in practice just seeing tons of patients and getting them through and doing the bills, or do you have a little time to breathe, and do
No,
you
I
have to
haven't.
go home and write those 20 notes for the 20 patients that you saw that day?
Well, everybody's style is different, and you probably
Hmm.
see this at your institution. Everybody interacts with the EMR in a different way. Some people are
Yeah,
templators, and others are texters. They
that's right.
are free texters, and I think that's true universally. My point of view, my last 15 years in practice on an EMR, was that I wanted the patient to leave with a note in hand that described what I thought was going on and what I wanted them to do and what was done.
Wow.
And uh, and so that was my approach. So I don't go home and write my notes. The only notes I would write were the new patients, because I
Okay.
thought
So how,
I thought the
yeah.
narrative was important, and I thought,
Uh-huh.
to a certain extent, my notes your notes serve three purposes. If- you know,
Billing. Number one.
No, no, not billing. Billing is the last purpose.
Okay.
The first purpose is to record what's going on with the patient.
Yep.
The the second purpose is to have something that the referring physician can look at so they know what's going on with their patient.
Yep.
The third purpose, and this is where things got diverted in a specialty practice and in all of medicine, was, let's say 20 years ago, was to have a document that prevented, that defended what you did, a malpractice
Mm.
type. And the fourth was billing, to justify billing, to keep you from being audited by Medicare, which is,
Mm-hmm.
in truth, the only one that really matters. The commercial insurers just play with you. Uh,
Mm.
Medicare, you're dealing with the law, and you're dealing with people who have a lot of power over your lives,
Yeah.
over
Yeah.
all of our lives. So, and you've learned that in academia, where there have been $400 million judgments against academic institutions, and people are or should be aware of that in private practice as well.
Yeah.
Um, I was asked to give a talk about adopting an EMR into private
Mm.
practice, or adapting
Mm-hmm.
to an EMR, either way. And it reminded me of the internist who was in the practice 45 years ago. He maintained his notes on a 5x8 card. And if you were his patient for more than 10 years, both sides were filled out, right?
Amazing.
Then in the 60s, 70s, malpractice became a thing. Lawyers began advertising about malpractice, and and people felt their notes needed to be better than that. And
Mm.
a lot of people dictated and had their notes typed up, or they wrote their notes, but they spent a lot of time in their notes above and beyond what was necessary uh, to convey what they thought was going on with the patient, and what they did. Um, and then as Medicare began, Medicare was introduced in like 1965, I think. Uh, they began to realize that it was unsustainable unless they supervised the
Mm.
billing process, did some auditing. Um, they began to set the rules on what their expectations were. What was a level 4 visit versus a level 2 visit?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember in the early '80s, we were in an audit. So once you're audited, you've already lost, because you have to respond to the audit, and that's a lot of nail biting and a lot of work.
Yeah.
And the process is not linear, and it's not well done. And even if everything you've done is perfect, it's still a very, very difficult and arduous process. And each time you interact with the government, you learn something. In fact, it's always good to tell the government that you learned something, because they realize that you have humility, and you're not out there to rape and pillage and burn. You're there to deliver medical care,
Yeah.
and you're one of the good people. Um, but you learn something, uh, and I learned at that point that your notes had to be written in a
Mm.
way that justified what you build.
Mm-hmm.
Government has a right to know that they're getting what they're paying for,
Yep.
which is what that's all about. But it gets a
Yep.
bit arcane, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, but I think, that's one of the points about private practice, that you sort of really need to understand that, because your butt is on the line. Whereas I feel like in academic medical centers, right, you have this whole institution that is sort of but behind you, and also overseeing, how I'm billing, how I'm writing my notes,
Right, right.
and letting me know that I'm billing too much or too little. Um, are there other challenges of private practice? I mean, one of the things that I hear from fellows is that they're concerned that they're not going to keep up with the literature, right? Like, in academics, we have this morning we have rheumatology grand rounds. Tomorrow we have, radiology conference and
Mhm,
journal club and all these
mhm.
didactics. We have trainees that are asking questions and letting us know about things that they researched. How does that compare to private practice?
It's very practical. Uh, Things change. People go to meetings. We all
Mm,
share the same information. And the beauty now is we live in the information age.
yeah,
So there isn't anything that you need that you can't get, that you can't learn. We use the telephone to call colleagues. We can email people and not disturb their day with questions. Um, the learning process doesn't stop, and to a certain extent, in a private practice setting, you have agility to to take on um, practical changes. So I think about two things. One is infusion therapy, and the other is ultrasound.
mm-hmm.
So in our practice, we had been doing ultrasound, and every member of the group did ultrasound in some fashion,
Wow,
not necessarily full diagnostics, but since 2009. And
amazing.
there are institutions that, even now, where the fellows are not trained in ultrasound and they're not supported to go out for training in ultrasound.
Right.
So, so there's agility uh, there. Um, what was the first one I mentioned? Because infusion
Infusions.
infusion therapy. Uh, when infusion first hit, well, the drug was Remicade. It was infliximab, and
Mm-hmm.
there was, the data was that it worked very well, and in some patients, it was of the TNFs that were available, it was, the best choice.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there was the concern that as rheumatologists, we couldn't handle the ethical dilemma of infusing the patient and collecting, billing for it and collecting funds,
Mm,
and getting more for giving more drug, right?
right.
That now somehow the rheumatologist felt, I think, that the oncologist could handle that ethical dilemma, but the rheumatologist, no way. One of my partners would say, Alan Matsumoto would say, rheumatologists are a bunch of 50 something at the time, 50 something males in blue blazers and tan pants who say, we don't make enough, we make less than everybody else in medicine, and we're going to defend the right to do that. Um, so, so there were those who felt that this was a abuse of the system,
Mm-hmm.
and there are others who felt this was a necessity, and
Mm-hmm.
infusion therapy was what rheumatologists do. Just like the ultrasound is the stethoscope for the hand of the rheumatologist, infusion therapy is one of the key therapeutic tools. Um,
Sure.
and whether you send it out or you did it in your office, where did you have the most control? Sending it out to a great extent is disastrous because the communication is terrible.
Yeah.
Home infusion, horrific,
Yeah.
a horrific problem. From the very first experiences where I allowed it to happen, on a 95-degree day, they would drop it off on the patient's doorstep because they weren't
Oh
home,
no.
right? Or the nurse would say, I have to leave now. I'll be back in 45 minutes when your infusion is over.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
so infusion therapy really is what part of what a rheumatologist does.
Mm-hmm.
And to have control over that from, as the surgeons would say, skin to skin,
Mm-hmm.
is critical in making it a worthwhile
Yeah.
experience for the patient and a safer experience for the patient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, I mean, that's one of the things that I'm now sort of reflecting on that. You keep on coming back to the patient experience, and that you sort of organize everything around that patient experience that may be a little bit more challenging in an academic setting where you're just one small
Yeah.
cog in the wheel. And I just tried getting my patient infusion. It took me a month. He has GCA and has been on having issues with high doses of steroids, trying to get him an infusion, and it's been it's been a challenge. So I can understand how by having control of everything, you may be able to deliver a better patient experience within private practice. something
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about
Yeah.
before.
I know it. If it doesn't drive everything that you do, yeah, in the end, even your bottom line is in the patient's interest. So what do I mean by that? Rheumatologists need to be successful enough economically to attract new rheumatologists into the field. And if you look at these Medscape uh, uh, physician income reports that come out every
Hmm.
year, you see rheumatologists are sort of at the bottom of that.
That's
And
right.
you may or may not remember, uh, you're too young to remember it as a primary recollection, unless you're very weird. In the early 90s, a former president of the ACR co authored an article about, it was an economic article evaluating the value of a rheumatology fellowship relative to just being an internist, relative
Ah,
to a gastroenterology fellowship.
oh yeah.
And they concluded that um, that the 2 year investment in rheumatology training is a poor investment, that over the course of a lifetime, an internist would generate more income because of the 2 years not in the full workforce.
Mm.
And when that, so you look at that and you say, okay, what was the fallout of that? The fallout of
Hmm.
that was that over the next 2 years, the number of rheumatologists taking the boards, actually 3 years, because there had to be a buffer time for people to make decisions about what they were going to do and then get to the point of taking their boards, fell 40%.
Oh my
The
goodness.
number of rheumatologists taking the boards between 1991 and 1994 fell 40%.
Wow.
So, um, so this this was a wake up call, and at the same time, in the mid 90s, managed care began to hit, and managed care uh, commercial reinsurance reimbursements fell horrifically at that point,
Mm.
and people were really struggling. So it struck me in the late 90s that we had to figure out how to deal with managed care, how to protect our practices and protect our bottom lines, because without that, we would never be able to attract new rheumatologists into the field. We can go down that alleyway if you want to discuss it, because I have a lot of
So
thoughts about
how did you think about addressing some of those needs that rheumatologists, weren't making enough, and maybe that rheumatology fellowship was a poor investment?
Well, I think the problem became exacerbated in the late 90s because managed care had begun to flex its muscle. And and they flex their, what you have are large corporations who are making decisions about how you're going to be reimbursed with absolutely no knowledge and no concern for your own costs of delivering the care. They're
Hmm.
completely insensitive to your own costs. If you take a Kaiser, for example, they're sensitive. They pay for bricks and mortar, and they pay
Yeah.
salaries to their doctors and to their nurses. But if you take United Healthcare or an Aetna US Healthcare at the time, they were completely insensitive to that. And
Interesting.
um, and so how do you get that across to these companies before you go under? And um, not only were they insensitive to how they paid you for the services you delivered, right? Your professional services, your office visits, your joint injections, your your consultations. Uh, but if part of what you provided were X-ray or laboratory, they farmed all of those things out, but they were part of your infrastructure. You built a lab, you owned
Hmm.
an X-ray unit, you hired an X-ray
Hmm.
tech, and now a portion of your business was going to be fallow. How do you
Hmm.
protect that? And what I learned from that, or what I concluded from that, was that you had to be larger. You had to have a strong enough
Uh,
practice for it to make a difference where you practiced. And you had to engage with managed care to A, explain that to them, and B, you had to
hmm.
be willing to disengage from managed care and create enough disruption for
Hmm.
them to respect you as a business. My I would say across the table from someone I was negotiating with managed care is that you're a business and you know what it takes to pay your bills, and we're a business, uh, and I, I began to think about it in real terms.
Hmm.
What was the value of an encounter in a practice that did its own laboratory and X-ray? When you pull that away as a source of, forget about how important it is to delivering the care, because it's very important. And I imagine that if you were in your clinic and you had somebody with a swollen knee or a painful shoulder that you wanted to inject, and you knew that within 4 minutes you could get the x-ray, and in fact, if the x-ray wasn't
Yeah.
satisfactory, you could talk to your x-ray tech and say, I need two more views. Imagine. And all of a sudden they
Yeah.
pull that away from you and you have to send them someplace else,
Yeah.
right? uh, that's an important inconvenience to the patient. But to you,
Yeah.
you've also paid for that infrastructure, and they pull that away. So I realized you had to be large
Mm.
enough for you to be able to hurt them, and you had to be firm enough to realize that you couldn't self-inflict the wound of staying with a company and letting it get stronger, and you needed tactics to do this. And what was a
Mm-hmm.
tactic? Well, one of the tactics was to do this during open season, when you could give your patients fair
Mm-hmm.
warning, right?
Mm-hmm.
You could write letters that would be an embarrassment to the insurance company, and but you know that you're large enough to put a lot of pressure on everybody else in your
Mm-hmm.
area, other rheumatologists, that they wouldn't be able to handle. And it's interesting because Hopkins just recently had a spat with their local Blue Cross Blue Shield carrier, and
Hmm.
they threatened to pull out just before open
Wow.
season. They sent a letter to 100,000 patients and
Oh
press
my
releases
goodness.
to the Washington Post and the Baltimore Sun, followed exactly the same playbook. But what's the purpose? The purpose is to preserve your own integrity, and your financial integrity is important to the patients you serve,
Yeah.
more than you would imagine.
Yeah.
Um, it's extremely important.
Yeah. So, and another thing about that I've heard about private practice is challenges in managing the complete care of a patient with specialists in other areas. Like, how do you don't have a nephrologist, a dermatologist, a cardiologist within your practice, and so within private practice, how do you help to sort of coordinate all the care that the patient needs, things that you're unable to offer in your
Well,
practice?
it's very doable. It was easier in the beginning, but for the past 10 years or so, most physicians in private practice have just completely stopped going to the hospital, or many have.
Yeah.
And the hospital has become, forgive the pun, inhospitable. Um, in truth, because we would cover 4 or 5 hospitals, and each one had its own different EMR. And instead of, and I say this in the nicest possible way, instead of the uh, the referring physician being that patient's doctor, their internist or family doc, or
Yeah.
it became a hospitalist,
Oh,
and a
yeah.
hospitalist was basically a very well educated shift worker who didn't own the patient. If you happened to see the patient when that person who called you wasn't on call, the other hospital would say, "Well, it's not my patient. I don't really know them, but I'm willing to listen to your description
Uh-huh.
of the problem." Um, so we decided this was not a good place for our time, and but the hospital was also a place where you would schmooze with other doctors. You got to
Got it.
know everybody. You interacted. You did consults for GI patients and cardiology and pulmonary patients. And they did those, and pulmonologists and cardiologists and GI did consults on your patients.
Yep.
Um, but so you have the local medical society, and you have a challenge for young doctors to know who to refer to. Us older folks know who to refer to because we still have those relationships. But
Mm-hmm.
as our relationships begin to retire, right,
Mm-hmm.
then it's the younger members of those physicians groups. Um, and so it's a focus when someone just enters private practice to how do they ingratiate themselves, how do they nest into a community, and it makes it all that more difficult to go into private practice solo than it
Mm-hmm.
was. Um,
Yeah.
but it's very doable because all of these subspecialty practices. It's not just the rheumatologist that exists out there. There are Harvard and Hopkins trained nephrologists and cardiologists and other really excellent institutions, uh, people well trained in our area. And you get to know them because you need to get to know
Yeah, that's interesting. So another challenge, I guess, is that, and I guess what you mentioned before, if you're in a solo private practice, doing those negotiations with insurance companies probably doesn't provide you with a lot of leverage. So I imagine that's the reason why many sort of organizations are buying up private practices um, to make it certainly more economical and profitable. Um, I don't know what your thoughts about are small private practices in rheumatology going to exist 5 or 10 years down the road?
well, I certainly hope so for the reasons I stated, because I think
Yep.
you're much more nimble in that situation. We've gone through other waves where practices were purchased and then um, either those practices expelled themselves or were expelled by the purchaser.
Mm,
And I don't know if this is a more sure-footed phase than it was back in the 90s or not. In fact, we sold ourselves at one point and then
mm,
bought ourselves back. Um, but I think there's a risk. And I think there's a very big risk for selling it. Yes, there's a short-term safety issue, but there's a long-term risk. So picture, if you will, a five-member rheumatology group that sells itself to Big City General,
mm-hmm,
whatever it might be, and the practice has infusion and X-ray and lab,
mm,
or make it a five-member cardiology group, all right? And they have an exercise lab and they have echocardiography and maybe they have nuclear cardiology, maybe they don't, and they're now purchased by Big City U or Big City Medical Center. Um, well, it's well known that the echocardiogram, the value of that now when it's owned by the hospital system, goes from $70 each to $250 each.
mm.
And it's very well known. And not only that, the cost accountants for these large institutions know that the cardiologist or the rheumatologist they purchased, um, they do cost accounting and they extricate from the revenues that you generate those ancillary revenues that they can generate
Oh,
themselves, the laboratory and the X-ray and the
interesting.
other downstream revenue.
Mm-hmm.
So as they cost account you and they look at the revenues that come in for you as a cognitive doctor, uh, the revenues are very low, and they cost account that they're paying you too much and they're losing money.
Mm,
And that's one risk. The other risk
mm-hmm.
is the regulators say, hey, you've got to divest yourself of this group because you're bilking us for four times the price of an echocardiogram or a joint injection or an ultrasound study, and we're not going to put up with it anymore. We're not going to give you the cost differential that we gave you last year. We're going to take that
Oh,
away,
interesting.
which makes you, as the physician, less valuable to the institution. Except you've been in the institution now for 2, 3, 4 years, and they move you out. Well,
Mm.
whatever reflexes you had about self preservation and running a business have atrophied, and you've
Oh,
got to
that's
start from
interesting.
scratch.
Yeah.
So that's a tremendous risk as I see it. I'm not sure if I explained it well,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Yeah. So, absolutely, the risk of sort of
so it's not how do I
selling.
save myself today? It's what's my trapdoor? What's my safety net under this? Because if
Yeah.
you're expelled
Yeah.
after 4 or 5 years, you may not have the wherewithal to
Yeah.
pick it up again.
What is what does career advancement look like for somebody in private practice? In academia, we have these goalposts, right? That I was instructor, assistant professor, associate, then you're professor, and then I don't know what happens then, but I hear good things. What does that look like in private practice?
Well, first, I have to tell you that for years, I participated in a um, uh, contracting in private practice for academicians. I'm sorry, contracting in practice, or a career in private practice, academic
Mm,
practice, industry,
mm,
and there'd be a different person giving each of those, and then there'd be a lawyer
hmm.
talking about your first year's contract, right?
Oh, cool. Yep.
And so each year, I did it for 7 or 8 years, and Greg Dennis, who had been in the military and then NIH, and then went into industry, did the industry talk. But the academician would be different each year. And really, Gary Firestone, uh, Steve Abramson, a couple
Hmm.
others gave the academic talk. And I listened to the academic talk, and I thought, boy, you guys each are young. There's no guarantee that you're going to get funding after your third, fourth, or fifth year. It's dismal. And then what do you do? So
Yeah.
uh, I thought, gee, my career path was a much safer path. Maybe I figured out a few things that maybe others haven't, but not really. There are a lot of really smart
Hmm.
people in private practice. After all, they all got into medical school. so
Not only that, but graduated from them.
and hell, I'm a clinical professor of medicine at GW and an associate clinical professor at University of Maryland. So those are honorifics. They're really not. They're really,
Hmm.
they don't have any. They don't have any value beyond what I can tell my mother, who's up in heaven somewhere, right? But uh, what does advancement look like? I think first advancement is, how will you look at your career as a career well done? I've faced that in retiring from practice. It's the appreciation you get from patients. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
it's the knowledge. It's the relationships you make with patients. Yeah, and as you settle into a practice and the practice is successful because you've built it, your revenue stream improves. But I think there's lots of room for creativity in practice. I just touched
Hmm.
on clinical trials, um, and the ability to publish. A lot of the major clinical literature in rheumatology is the authors are in the private practice setting. We don't stop learning. I wondered the same thing as a medical student, how the private practice hematologist oncologist knew so much about genetics and about
Hmm.
uh, anti-neoplastic drugs, that he was in practice for 20 or 25 years, and these were only on the market for 3 or 4, right? It's because practice evolves.
Yeah.
um, and it doesn't this knowledge doesn't belong to anybody, it belongs to everybody.
Yeah. And for people that are interested in exploring life as a private practice rheumatologist, either fellows that are finishing their fellowship or academics that want to see what private practice is like, what do you recommend that they do?
Mm.
How can they get sort of a better understanding of what private practice is like?
And we all have contacts with one another. The academics have private practice contacts and vice versa. um, having collegial discussions, I think, is helpful. We have at least four 4 or 5 members of our group who were in academia anywhere from 3 years to 20 years before they joined practice. I
Hmm.
think their experiences have been excellent. I think they would tell you that. It's unusual that someone goes from a private practice setting back into academics. You may have those experiences, um, but we're all blind men grabbing a piece of the elephant, trying to figure out what that is rheumatology, right?
That is rheumatology.
Yeah.
I think that that's a great place to end it. The blind rheumatologist with the elephant. Herb, this has been a really wide-ranging conversation, and I really appreciate your time. And thank you so much for your insights into private practice.
Well, you're welcome. It was a pleasure sharing with you. Love to do it again.